The economist Stephen Landsberg states that most of economics can be summarized in 4 words. People respond to incentives. The rest is commentary. And he's absolutely right. An incentive is just a reason to do something. Getting paid is an incentive to go to your job every day. Having clean clothes is an incentive to do the laundry. And having a healthy marriage is an incentive to treat your wife with kindness and respect. A very common economic lessons that conservatives repeatedly use is don't look at the intentions of a policy, look at the incentives of a policy. A related concept is punishment and reward. So if you want to understand how a government policy affects behavior, look at what is punished and look at what's rewarded. So my dog Josh won't jump up onto the counter because he knows he'll be scolded. That scolding changes my dog's incentive. He has an incentive to jump up on the counter in order to grab a piece of chicken. But knowing that he's going to be scolded changes the incentives. Getting a chicken plus a scolding is no longer worth it for him. The government changes the incentives of our policies all the time with punishment and reward. But only rarely are these punishments and rewards the intended goal of a policy. For example, sin taxes on cigarettes and alcohol are not intended to raise money. Their intention is to deter smoking and drinking. Similarly, the goal of the home mortgage deduction is to change people's behavior, to encourage people to buy houses. That creates stable neighborhoods, it creates stability for children, it develops social capital and cohesiveness within localized communities. Punishment and reward is a very important lens through which to view our government policies, and it gives rise to a common slogan in economic circles. You get less of what you tax and more of what you subsidize. We tax cigarettes, so we get less cigarette smoking. We subsidize home buying, so we get higher rates of home ownership. Unfortunately, the vast majority of our government policies are based on good intentions, not a hard-headed analysis of the incentives. And what happens in that case is what economists call the law of unintended consequences. The economist James Gortney has one of my favorite examples in his book Common Sense Economics. In the former Soviet Union, managers and employees of glass plants were at one time rewarded according to the tons of glass sheet they produced. Because their revenues depended on the weight of the glass, most factories produced sheet glass so thick that you could hardly see through it. The rules were changed so that managers were compensated according to the number of square meters of glass they could produce. Under these rules, Soviet firms made glass so thin that it broke easily. Communism is essentially a witch's brew of good intentions mixed with bad incentives. Let's take a look at Karl Marx's famous slogan, "From each according to their ability, to each according to their need." That's a good way to express the spirit of communism, but now let's look at it through the lens of punishment and reward. What is punished? Hard work, because workers wouldn't make any extra money no matter how much extra work they did. And what's rewarded? Being lazy and shirking on the job, because you still get an equal share no matter how much you shirk. Just based on our analysis of incentives, we would predict that communism destroys the work ethic and makes people lazy, and that's exactly what we've seen. The economist John Macmillan explains in the book Reinventing the Bizarre. Communist China put Marx's slogan into practice. What they did was they nationalized all the farms so that the peasants worked them collectively. So people who worked hard got just as much food as people who shirked. And sure enough, the outcome was a lot more shirking. And since no one wants to be the only sucker, even the hard workers started shirking too when they saw what everyone else was doing. The Chinese Anhui province was known as the granary of China, but after communism, things got so bad that the people couldn't even feed themselves. In fact, they were tragically forced to resort to cannibalism. And the cannibalism was so severe that what they did was they essentially had to trade dead children with neighboring families because no one wanted to eat their own children. So if you ever run into a leftist who wants to champion communism, just tell them about the Anhui province of China and their experiments with it. In 1978, people from the Zhaigang village met in secret, and what they decided to do was to divide the commune into privately owned lots, one lot for each family. So basically what they did is they switched back to capitalism from communism, and once they did that, their harvest skyrocketed. As one farmer explained, "You can't be lazy when you work for your family and yourself." Neighboring villages saw their success, and they switched to private property, and the practice began to spread more and more widely throughout China. Luckily for the villagers, this happened at a time when the old guard in the Communist Party was being challenged. The reformers allowed the experiments to continue, and by 1984 there were no communes left. The lesson is that communism is the world's most powerful system for creating poverty, and capitalism is the world's most powerful system for creating wealth. You sometimes hear leftists who argue that capitalism only benefits the rich, but next time you run into one of those leftists, I would recommend bringing up the Chinese peasants who were forced to trade dead children with their neighbors so that they would have something to eat. Now, it's very easy to pick on communism, and I do plan to do it regularly, but leftists in the United States aren't a whole lot better. So let's look at a couple examples where leftists ignored the incentives of a policy and thereby ran afoul of the law of unintended consequences. The first is the Americans with Disabilities Act. It had very good intentions. It was designed to boost unemployment for the disabled, and the way they did that was by requiring workplaces to be more accessible. However, the incentives were quite different, because making workplaces accessible costs money. Research by Darren Asimoglu and Joshua Angrish shows that the act actually caused a drop in employment for the disabled. Moreover, this drop was concentrated in medium-sized firms, and there's a good reason for that. Large firms could afford to make the accommodations for the Americans with Disabilities Act, and small firms were exempted from the act, but medium-sized firms were just stuck in a bind. And so what they did was they just started to refuse to hire disabled workers. Here's a second example of leftists ignoring the law of unintended consequences. In the late 1990s, federal regulations for student loans were weakened, and according to research by Adam Loney and Konstantin Yanelis, this actually resulted in harming less skilled workers. The weaker regulations did lead to more students going to college, but it was relatively weak students who could only get into poor-performing, low-value institutions. And most of these students failed to complete a degree, struggled to repay their loans, and defaulted at high rates, and didn't have much success on the job market. So the end result of all this was workers not getting a degree, but being stuck with student loan debt.